what we encounter in the culture is really designed to sharpen us as believers. And all these things that we're talking about, abortion, the things that may trouble us, it gives us an opportunity, gives the church an opportunity to educate their congregation and to ensure that every single person in that congregation knows the truth and can proclaim it.
Thank you for joining me. We're going to spend some time this hour talking about a biblical perspective on government, on law, on individual rights, education, and much, much more. Comes from this new book by Keisha Russell, who is certainly no stranger to this broadcast, Uncommon Courage, Defending Truth and Freedom While There's Still Time. 250 pages, 11 chapters, published by our good friends at Harvest House. We have information about it on the website in case you can't find it in your local bookstore. And we're going to work our way through all sorts of different chapters, which I think you're going to find very helpful. Keisha Tony Russell has worked as a federal law clerk on the Fifth Circuit Court. We talked about that recently. Of course, is a constitutional lawyer with First Liberty Institute, individual that has a degree or a couple of degrees in the area of education, but also attended Emory Law School and was the 2017 Emory University Graduating Woman of Excellence. And it is great to have you in studio once again.
Always a pleasure, Kerby.
This book I've been aware of for some time. You sort of had to put it on hold because you went and became a law clerk, which I think was a very prestigious appointment there as well. But now it is out, and I know Penn has talked with you about this, but I thought we would give it a full look at it today. But first of all, your first chapter really gives us the history, and people know you as a lawyer, but I've also introduced you a few times as an individual that was a teacher. And in some respects, both of those credentials are really relevant to what you're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, absolutely. My background as a teacher, I think, really helped shape not just my career, but also my relationship with Christ. And so as a teacher, I really learned to hear from the Lord and also advocate for people, my students, who were in my class because of behavioral disorders. And I don't even know if I've told you this, but I did teach students that were no longer allowed in the general education classroom because of their behavioral problems.
Right.
So a lot of those students, they were deficient in reading and things like that, but generally speaking, their IQs were okay. They were just misbehaving so much that they weren't learning.
Yes.
And so I got pretty much all those kids in one classroom. And so the battle became not just about teaching them academics, but also teaching them character and teaching them self-control and teaching them perseverance and teaching them that they could be, whatever they wanted to be. And that took some time. I spent a lot of time doing cultural building in the classroom, and then I was able to kind of move into the academics after that. And I learned very quickly that the students had been taught some pretty detrimental things, including what we call now critical race theory.
Yes.
And maybe then we didn't call it that, but it's the same thing, And so I really had to deprogram them and teach them who they were without saying who they were in Christ, but teaching them that they were more than what they thought of themselves. And so that teaching really just kind of pushed me, I think, to be an advocate in a broader way. And so I decided that I was going to go to law school. I actually felt led to do that. And I was attracted to Emory because of their Center for the Study of Law and Religion. And so I ended up going to Emory eventually, and then working in the Center for Law and Religion, being mentored by a rabbi who taught me religious liberty in this incredible field that so few people even know exists. And that's where I was introduced to this amazing thing. And after that, I started interning for First Liberty Institute, and the rest is history.
Well, it's so good that we have you here and can call on you every once in a while. And it was a loss when you were a federal law clerk and could not join us around the table. But let's get into it. The first chapter is on Christianity and the Constitution. You see, I have my copy of John Eidsmoe there, and you and I have both read the same book. But let's get into that for just a bit, because frankly, a lot of the listeners, if they even took a civics class, and now sometimes we don't even teach that in some classes, certainly didn't get the Christian foundation for that. And when we look at the fact that if you start with a biblical view of human nature and the need for us to control power, you end up with a government very much like the one that we have described in the Declaration of Independence and actually defended in the Federalist Papers.
Yeah, definitely. So I think it's really important that students start with that kind of foundation. I think we skip all of that, and we definitely skip sort of the Christian foundation that our country was based upon. And students need to understand this because they need to understand why we have the rights that we have, what the thought process was behind the creation of our Constitution. And this is also that they can see when it's being unraveled. It's not enough for them just to know the text of the Constitution. They need to understand why. And so that's the reason why I wrote that particular chapter, because I think, and we're not just talking about students either. I met so many Christians in talking to them about my cases that our clients at First Liberty Institute, and so many Christians don't understand how robust and strong the protection of the First Amendment really is. And I think it's because they don't understand these basic principles.
It is not by happenstance that the First Amendment is the First Amendment for a lot of reasons in terms of free speech and freedom of religion and the rest. But one other thing I want to put on the table, and then we'll get into tyranny, because that is a very significant section of your book. But before we do so, a lot of people are confused. Is this a democracy or is it a republic? And you really deal with that issue as well, don't you?
Yeah, we're not a pure democracy, as most of your listeners know that, because you do such a great job of educating them. We are a republic, right? We elect representatives to vote for us for laws and things like that. And one of the reasons for that is that sometimes the majority is wrong. And that's a hard thing to say to people, but it's true, and if you look throughout history, you can see instances when the majority of people believe things that just weren't true or completely immoral. And so that protects us from having sort of a big state like California, Texas, from running the entire country. Our smaller states still have a voice, and having a Republican form of government allows that.
Yes. Well, and again, this idea of individual rights, because your second section in your book gets into slavery. And again, you could say, well, if we had a vote, more than 51% of the South said slavery should be legal, but we certainly rose up, and the abolition movement, eventually even the Civil War, ended that. And so there are some really concerning issues there. And you do talk about this idea of individual rights, and that brings us back to another key principle. If the government gives you their rights, then the government can take them away. But if instead God gives you the rights and government is simply recognizing that those rights are endowed by what? Our Creator, then that's a real different idea as well, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. And that's so important for people to get, that our individual rights are God ordained. And that's the reason why the government must protect them. And so, for example, when we look at something like freedom of religion or free speech, the founders felt like this is a right that God wanted us to have. God wants us to be free to choose whatever religion we want. God wants us to be free to speak freely and to not be afraid. And that is why the government has to protect those rights. It's not necessarily because the government is saying, oh, out of the goodness of our hearts, we're going to give you freedom of religion and freedom of speech. We are holding the government to a contract. And that's what the Constitution is, a contract between the government and the people of the United States.
Keisha, one of the chapters, matter of fact, one of the more significant ones, chapter 2, and then you get into it again in chapter 3, is this road to tyranny. And whether you look at a sort of popular book like 1984 or a little bit more academic book, The Origin of Totalitarianism, as soon as we talk about the positive, there is a natural tendency, even in republics, even in democracies and in other countries around the world, towards totalitarianism. And certainly one example that you give is how very easily it is to slip into that situation.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this is the portion that Americans really need to pay close attention to, because our emotions are being manipulated to kind of prime us to be easily taken over by immoral thoughts and ideologies. So, for example, with all of those things that we taught, Origins of Totalitarianism, 1984, they all kind of outline very similar things. And the first is that you divide and isolate people, right? In 1984, people weren't allowed to talk. They weren't allowed to fall in love. They weren't allowed to have relationships, because when you are in a totalitarian society, your only devotion should be to the government, to be to the leader. And the same is true in, Nazi Germany. The same is true with Stalin. They, these kinds of leaders want to be the only ones. And then the next step, which we are at in America for sure, is searing the conscience. That means convincing people to agree with things that they know are immoral or wrong. And that will necessarily prime the population to begin to either socially exterminate or physically exterminate people who the government doesn't like. So whether that be Jewish people, whether that be Christians, whether that be, between the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda, all of these things are designed to make sure that people have a seared conscience that no longer pricks them to stand up for people who are now being persecuted in several different ways, either socially or physically.
And then the last one is this idea of exterminate, which
Yes.
I think is really something, because you would, if you'd seen, for example, China before Mao took over, you would say this is an advanced culture.
Mm-hmm.
If you looked at Germany before Hitler took over, you couldn't even have put your head around the idea of the Holocaust. We, of course, used the Hutus and the Tutsis for just a minute, and of course, in Rwanda, but there are various, very, if you will, advanced cultures where we've seen just enormous number of people. Stalin's Russia, Mao's China, Pol Pot. And in some respects, we have to be mindful of the fact that once those individuals are in power and have complete power, extermination sometimes is the next step.
Yeah, and it usually is the intent from the very beginning.
Yes.
We're just not told. People aren't told. So Hitler didn't necessarily tell Germany, okay, we're going to kill every Jewish person when I'm a leader. But he knew that was his goal from pretty early on. And so he just let the population begin to seethe over things that he told them about the Jewish people, and so that they would tolerate it. And not only that, they would be so afraid that they wouldn't speak up. Now, when I talk about soft totalitarianism in America, what a lot of you can kind of think back to is the days of COVID. And when we were really being controlled by the government through social media companies to control what we said. And we couldn't speak about the vaccine. We couldn't say anything the government didn't want us to say. And that is sort of the beginning of the end for freedom. And that includes in America, too. I mean, now we know the Biden administration was working with Facebook and really forcing them to deplatform people who weren't saying the right message. And so this is one example, right? Like just one example that's happening in America right now. But there's more. If you talk about, for a while, you couldn't say marriage was between a man and a woman. All of these things that are just like very, very foundational for our belief system and for living in America. But we were being so controlled, and that's what happens in totalitarian societies. For us, it was deplatforming, but in Europe now, you can go to jail for saying things that the government doesn't want you to say.
Well, and even in Europe now, they're talking about something that looks like a social credit score. Now, in your book, you talk about, of course, the social credit score in China. That is, you get points if you say things positive about the communist Chinese government, and you lose points. And you lose enough points, you can't get on public transportation. If that was totally implemented, you couldn't even buy certain kinds of food. You couldn't leave certain areas. And, of course, the other way to implement that, and we'll get into that maybe in future programs, with a CBDC, a central bank digital currency. And they're talking about having that in Europe. Well, if I can control your money and I can control your social credit score, pretty much I have created a digital prison. It's just an open air prison, but I can control everything you do. I can punish anything that I consider to be bad behavior, and I can reward any kind of good behavior. And that looks like a prison system. It's just that we don't have bars around the windows, but we certainly have the possibility of that. And that's why you say that that's a threat to religious freedom in America, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And because religion, and particularly Christianity, the church is supposed to be, say, the moral compass of our country. And we're supposed to speak out against things like slavery, like segregation, those things that the abolitionists talked about and civil rights activists talked about. We know Martin Luther King was, motivated by his Christian beliefs, right? And so these things are foundational and important. And unfortunately, we're in a postmodern society that doesn't appreciate those kinds of things and definitely doesn't want to hear them. And so we get punished for saying things that are biblical, and we get punished. And ultimately, it works. You start to see a chilling effect in the church. You start to see a chilling effect with people who go to work and don't want to speak up when something wrong is going on, or when even a topic comes up that they don't believe in. They don't want to say, oh, no, I don't believe in that. I think that's wrong. And this goes all the way to parents who didn't want to speak up when men were in the locker rooms with their children, girls. And we see that happening and happened for a long time before we're at this point now where so many people are now speaking out against it because they know. But for many, many years, these parents were persecuted. They lost their children if they didn't want to, give in to gender transition and things like that. This is some heavy persecution that's happening and will lead ultimately to tyranny if we get the wrong people in government.
The first section, of course, is the foundation for freedom. The second one is on keeping your conscience, and we'll look at some aspects of that. Matter of fact, 2 chapters on honor the golden rule. But even in your chapter on fear God, you sort of answer the question, Keisha, that I think some of our older listeners have had, and even some younger ones. That is, how did we get here? And you take us through kind of how we were indulging in what you call new freedom. And first it was changing the laws on divorce, and then it was changing the laws on birth control, and then eventually it was the abortion decision. Well, once we went down there, then it was changing laws on sodomy and pornography, and then eventually it was redefining marriage. And in some respects, none of that was announced ahead of time. Every bit of that was incremental, but now once we turned our back on our conscience, we no longer applied biblical principles, we ended up where we are right now in this particular situation.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of some things that you see in the Bible, right? Where, even Satan is tempting Jesus. He doesn't tell Jesus that he's going to completely ruin his life if he accepts what Satan's offering, right? And so it's not where things start. It's where they end. And so when we start with a government that says, okay, well, you can get divorced just because you don't like this person anymore. Or you know what? You can decide whether or not you're going to have that living baby, even though it's up to you that this has happened. So these kinds of things, sort of this leniency in the government to redefine standards that at one point were pretty etched in stone, is kind of why we got to a place where now we're allowing these grown men to be in the locker room with little girls. And the reason is because we have changed the standard so that there isn't a standard anymore. And so you can't advocate for one. So if you say, well, the standard is men and women get married and that's it, and you eradicate that particular standard, well, then what do you have to lean on in order to say to people, you can no longer, you can't be with a child, or you can't be with this kind of person, or you can't be with that. These kinds of things unravel the entire institution. And in order to save it, we have to protect the foundational beliefs that are attached to them.
Yes. Unraveling it. So whether it's a row of dominoes dropping or taking out some of those Jenga pieces, either way, whether it's Jenga or dominoes, you can see how we ended up there. Let me mention that, first of all, you should be able to find the book in your local bookstore, about 250 pages, 11 chapters, published by Harvest House. But we also have a way in which you can contact Keisha. KeishaTonyRussell.com. Don't even have to know how to spell all that because the link is right there. And that will give you some information that you can have, as well as, most importantly, not only will you learn about the book, but there's a button that you can click on for speaking, and that gives you an opportunity to contact her as well and learn a little bit more about some of the resources. So if you're looking for the book, you can find it in a local bookstore. Of course, we also have it linked on our website at pointofview.net. And again, you can get that in either paperback or Kindle. But Keisha, let me talk about Honor the Golden Rule, Part 1 and Part 2. Really some dark chapters of American history, from a civil war to civil rights. And we should also, as we talk about America's godly heritage, talk about some of the flaws. And one of those, of course, is slavery.
Yeah, definitely. So the idea of honoring the Golden Rule is really handling the idea of supremacy within us, this idea that we are above other people and we deserve better than someone. And that's what slavery was all about, right? So I think slavery and us talking about that and really acknowledging sort of the framers, and not that they overlooked slavery, but they didn't declare in the Constitution that slavery was unconstitutional, and they could have, right? And so while acknowledging that the foundational principles of the Constitution were good, moral, we can also at the same time acknowledge that people are applying these principles and dealing with these things, and people are flawed. And so they're going to make the wrong decisions sometimes. But ultimately, we were able to rise out of it. And I think the idea of supremacy, and it really kind of leads into the idea of abortion, which people don't like, and they don't like the idea that a lot of conservatives say supremacy and this idea of racial cleansing and things like that was what ultimately led to abortion, and why we have that right now. And I think it's really easy to see what's the ultimate way to honor someone else is to honor their right to life. It's to honor the fact that they are allowed to live. That's it. That's a very basic principle that I think very few people would disagree with. But then you see a lot of leftists now, one of their tactics is to say that the baby isn't alive, but none of them can tell you when it actually becomes alive, right? If it's not at conception. And that's why, because they're wrestling with this truth that they are, in fact, killing a human being, and they're trying to wiggle out of that. And I think the best thing we can do is hold their feet to the fire on that point and help them confront it. I had a conversation with a woman who, she was very upset about the what she felt where it was police brutality against blacks and things like that. And I asked her if she had ever had an abortion, and she said she had 3 and she wasn't ashamed. And I asked her, well, don't you think it's important for you to recognize that you've killed more black people than that cop that you are upset with right now? And obviously it didn't go well. But she did actually confront the point later, a couple weeks later. But it's important. We have to keep throwing this, to people in people's faces. Like, this is a life. And if we continue to say when that life is worth or living, then eventually we won't be able to stop that. We'll be able to say that about any group of people, which is why a lot of leftists are having trouble right now. I mean, the treatment of the Jewish community at Columbia and things like that. All of that is because they have no respect for the honoring the golden rule, frankly.
One of the things I like about this is you do make the connections, and I think they are there because you have, again, this idea of slavery. And then after, of course, the Civil War, and during the time in which Charles Darwin writes The Origin of Species, but it also talks about favored races. So you already have the beginnings there. Then you talk about Francis Galton, who was the founder of the British eugenics movement, who was a cousin of Darwin. Later on, Darwin's son also headed that up. And then you take it to Margaret Sanger, you take it to Adolf Hitler, you take it to the issue of abortion, and then eventually even take it to the issue of legalized infanticide. And so there's a sense in which there is a direct connection, and it's a connection that not many people want to make, and you make it in the book, and I think you make it very persuasively, and it's a reminder that whether you're talking about abortion, whether you're talking about slavery, whether you're talking about Jim Crow, whether you're talking about segregation, whether you're talking about Planned Parenthood, it's all connected, isn't it?
Yeah, and you cannot separate these issues, even though the left tries really hard to do that. And even a lot of Christians I've spoken to try to, justify abortion, and with all of these, ridiculous arguments about what if that person is going to end up in an abortion or an adoption agency and they end up in a bad life. But it's not up to us to make those decisions about someone else's life. That's up to God. And if we're Christians and we truly believe in his will, then we will allow that person to be born and let God take care of the rest.
I might just mention there's a lot other things to cover there, but I want to certainly cover all of the books. So about this time, people are going, okay, I'm a little bit discouraged. So what do I need to do? And you are smart enough in Chapter 7 to talk about live with purpose, but especially this idea of kingdom agenda. Because really we need to, even though we look around us and we see some things that need to be changed. Matter of fact, you have a chapter on criminal justice and one on education. We'll get to those probably soon enough. But at that point, you just felt the need to remind us that don't get bogged down with the details. We really need to follow a kingdom agenda, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, this is where Christians were part of God's kingdom, and he has an agenda, and he wants us to help him fulfill it. And all those words in the Bible will help direct us, but also what we encounter in the culture is really designed to sharpen us as believers. And all these things that we're talking about, abortion, the things that may trouble us, it gives us an opportunity, gives the church an opportunity to educate their congregation and to ensure that every single person in that congregation knows the truth and can proclaim it.
Well, again, some of the other issues you address, and I'll just pick them off real quickly. One is on the issue of justice, established justice and American justice, but in particular, you had a whole section, if I remember, yes, on criminal justice flaws, and we've done some booklets and some articles on that. But as a lawyer, I don't think we've really ever taken the time to talk about some of the things that need to happen in our criminal justice system. And looking at that from your unique vantage point, I think you actually point out some things that we need to fix.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the things that I say, which I think is probably the most controversial in my opinion, is that the 13th Amendment should be amended to reflect a proper view of slavery. And, the 13th Amendment says that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. Now, my view is that slavery is immoral completely, and it's not immoral until someone deserves it. And so I think that's something that we can look at and say, is it really okay to use prisoners for free labor? Now, we all have, I'm not sticking up for prisoners. I'm just saying that
yes,
this idea of slavery is improper and we shouldn't be justifying it in any way in the 13th Amendment. And then we have this, a couple sections on prison labor and, how that works. And really, I think there are ways to work around the slavery issue in a sense that we don't have to, force labor upon anyone.
I think that makes some sense. And again, I'll hold up the booklet we did on criminal justice, but that was more in the criminal justice system. But this whole section you have here on the prison labor, racial disparities, mass incarceration, private prisons, and all the rest probably is something we might want to cover in the future. So I certainly think that would be another one of those chapters that you might want to dig into. I'd be remiss if I did not ask Keisha about education, and that gets us into everything from, of course, critical race theory, as well as what you talked about, the school-to-prison pipeline, which we mentioned years ago and haven't talked about since. So, again, you dig into some things that I think we need to understand. And as a former teacher, I think we should recognize that right now there are individuals suggesting maybe we get rid of the Department of Education. But whether we do or not, I think as a teacher, you will admit, as most people have to, that when you look at the nation's report card, and you mentioned that recently in another letter that I saw that you write, we're just not doing a very good job. If we were actually producing the best and the brightest students, and if indeed those students were going to be successful in the future, we might even turn a blind eye to some of the crazy things being taught in the classroom. But instead, what we're doing is teaching things that certainly are not helpful, probably harmful, and we're not producing good students. You also get into the fact that we've got this sexualization of children, which we've talked about with you. So there's just a lot of work that needs to happen in the public schools.
Yeah, I mean, I think the mark of any good school is that they teach you how to read at least, right? I mean, that's sort of a basic expectation, and that's not even happening at this point. We know one of the latest America's Report Card said that nearly 40%, I think 40% of fourth graders couldn't read at grade level, which is almost half people. So that's very disturbing.
Very.
And, we do know that, illiteracy is one of the first paths to going to prison, committing crimes and things like that. 3 out of 5 inmates in prison can't read at all. So we know there's a direct correlation there. And so we definitely need to start holding our schools to account on this issue that not only should you be teaching students, number one, how to read, reading, writing, arithmetic, all of these things that are really important, indoctrinating them in these other ridiculous progressive ideas isn't helping either. Because that's how you get, what we were talking earlier about people on TikTok who are talking about socialism as if it's the bee's knees because they just don't know any better, right? And I think that's what's happening. We really need to start taking control of our schools. Private schools are great, but public schools aren't going anywhere, and 90% of students are in public schools. So Christians start, holding tight to those public schools in your neighborhood. We need to get control of that area.
One of the things that you do talk about is the need for us to have discernment, because these last 2 chapters are one about the concern about propaganda and not getting good information. One of the reasons why certainly you and many people at First Liberty appreciate Point of View, because we're trying to get information out that you might not get anywhere else. And then also the need to take a stand. But first of all, you talk about speak and recognize truth. We can't be silent, as you pointed out. But it is sometimes difficult, especially during the pandemic and even now some of the counter comments back and forth, to know who to trust. And I think it's going to be really incumbent upon Christians in this 21st century to really hone their skills at discernment, don't you think?
Absolutely. It's really important. And the best way to do that, obviously, is to be in the Word regularly. But I think the other thing is understanding that you don't necessarily have to have a YouTube channel with millions of subscribers. You have an area of influence in your own life. And no matter what you do, whether it's you're home with your kids and you are carpooling, or you're having, PTA meetings, or you're with parents, or you're in an office every day, there is an area of influence, and God has called you to be a light no matter where you are. And I think everyone can do that. But knowing the truth first is important so that you can proclaim it. And I also think, we all have people in our lives who are either on the fence about Christianity or don't really understand what conservatives, think or mean. And you have an opportunity to educate people about that all the time, but you have to educate yourself first.
One other chapter, of course, is Take a Stand, and I know that you certainly have, and I've seen you at various venues. Matter of fact, one of those shows you actually testifying in front of the United States Senate about Amy Coney Barrett. I've seen some of the videos of you in churches speaking on this issue, so again, I hope some people will consider having you come and speak. But a lot of that is taking a stand, and so whether it's a public, visible stand like you have taken so many times, or whether it's just taking a stand and deciding to go across the street and talk to your neighbor about the gospel, I think there are some real needs for us today as the church to be the church, right?
Yeah, and so many, I think, Christians have been silenced because they are afraid of being ridiculed or, made fun of or whatever it is. And in some ways, getting in trouble at work. First Liberty has clients who are in trouble for speaking the truth. But you can't let that stop you. Jesus has told us what's going to happen to the people who love him in our culture. And thankfully, we live in America, and we don't have to worry about necessarily this really hard physical punishment. But at the same time, I think we always need to be willing to stand up to the culture no matter what, because, Jesus wants us to be a light for him. And ultimately, a lot of the things I say in my book, I think will help at least give everyone a foundation and the ability to speak truth with confidence. One of the things I talk about is apologetics, and I talk about it very, very briefly. But I think once you understand why the gospel is true, why you can trust the Bible, then it makes you even more confident about it, and it inspires you even more to talk more about Jesus and what he's done.
Again, the book is entitled Uncommon Courage. I was thinking there's 11 chapters, but adding the introductory chapter, there's 12. People looking for a way to teach a small group, usually you break it into quarters. That's 13 weeks. And I think this almost matches up perfectly. This book is written in such a way that anybody that maybe wanted to understand some of these big ideas like government and religious liberty, and maybe understand a little bit of our history, slavery and abortion and criminal justice, they could understand that. But the way this is put together, this could actually be a small group study where you could take a chapter a week, have everybody read it, then come back together and talk about that. Or if you would want to maybe have you come and speak and do a kickoff or something like that, that would be just another way in which churches could use this, because it's really, even though it's called Uncommon Courage, you could just as easily say, Keisha educating you about government and religious liberty and rights and social issues and how to think about it from a biblical point of view. So in some respects, I think this would be a small group study as well.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason why I called it Uncommon Courage is because I was motivated and inspired by our clients who really have to exercise some incredible courage to stand up to the government because of their faith, but also the righteous are as bold as a lion. I feel like God has called us to be brave and courageous, and I think that's what it takes to be someone who speaks truth in this culture right now.
Well, I would just say that, again, this is a book that you would really want to have, and it's very readable and easy to understand. And it's, in one case, is certainly educating you about these issues. But on the other hand, it's a warning because, as you point out, the seeds of tyranny have taken root, and you are seeing that many times you are having to defend clients and churches and others you never would have thought you would have to have defended even a few years ago.
Yeah, I mean, we're representing a woman named Marisol Castro right now, a teacher, 32-year veteran teacher in Connecticut, who keeps a small crucifix by her desk, her personal workspace, and is currently on paid administrative leave because they want her to take that crucifix down or put it under her desk, and I mean literally under her desk at her knees or in a drawer. So they want her to hide this crucifix because they don't think the children should see it, or they don't think anyone should see it. Now, what is that nonsense? This is America. That is not what the First Amendment says, and yet we're having to sue a school district over a crucifix. I mean, these things are just, it's so out of hand at this point, and the book is meant to address some of that.
Well, that's why we need Uncommon Courage, and that's why I would suggest you need the book, Uncommon Courage. I'm so delighted that Harvest House has published it. It is out. It is easy to find, but if you would like to know more about the book, we have a link on our website at pointofview.net. Click on the picture of Keisha, then go to see more, and we actually take you to her personal website, so you might want to actually contact her, maybe find out more about her speaking. You might want to get a copy of the book through her particular organization, however that might be. And, of course, you can also go to First Liberty and find about that as well. Keisha, it's always great to have you in studio. Thank you for writing the book, and thank you for giving us an hour today.
Really appreciate you having me on. Always a pleasure.
Let me just mention that, again, the book is entitled Uncommon Courage, Defending Truth and Freedom While There Is Still Time. Don't forget that if you would like more information about what we're talking about, you can find it at the website pointofview.net. That's all we have for today. We look forward to seeing you next time right here on Point of View Highlights.